according to a congressional scholar.
It's easier to be for reform when you're in the minority rather than when you're in the majority, and we may see that they back off some of these reform commitments.
It's easier in the minority because then all you have to do is talk about change. When you're in the majority, you're expected to actually affect it. That's a new role for these Republicans, none of whom has ever served in a majority in Congress, and they might find it a harder job than they expected. One longtime Republican staffer said to me this morning, the dog caught the bus, Peter.
Cokie, a question about the relationship between Republicans in the Congress and the Republican victories in the state. What do you think it is?
Well, they're very different Republicans. The ones in the Congress are much more conservative than the pragmatic Republican governors that did very well yesterday again in re-elections. And if these Republicans in Congress send them a bunch of constitutional amendments, it'll be interesting to see how the Republican governors feel about them. They might not want a federal balanced budget, for instance, because they might want federal money. You
have been on the Hill a long time, and I recall you saying yesterday that one of the things that's really been undercut up there is experience.
Oh, no question. You've now got on the Republican side nobody who was here in the 1950s, hardly any who were here in the 1960s. That's true on the Democratic side as well. And we're going to see a brand new group. This is a majority elected since 1990, Peter.
Husband who is abusive.
Yeah.
Why did you stay?
I didn't know what else there was for me.
I have no thoughts about what it is to have a relationship with a father.
What is it with you and Rockstar?
Heather Locklear, Kelsey Grammer, and Brett Butler on an all-new Barbara Walters special tonight on ABC.
The Republican victory at the state level yesterday is particularly interesting because the Republicans in Washington have every intention of sending a lot of federal business back to the states as constitutional amendments. And the states are now much more Republican. Democratic governors have outnumbered Republicans 29-19. The new lineup will be 30 Republicans to 17 Democrats, and as we said earlier, two races are still too close to call. In New York, Mario Cuomo, who was running against his long record, lost.
We sensed all across this nation a negativism, a harshness, a divisiveness, a willingness to pit people against one another.
The Democrats held on to 9 states. Independents won 2. But of the 36 governor's races, the Republicans held on to 12 and took 11 from the Democrats, including the seat of the Democratic governor in Texas, Ann Richards. 4 years ago, she won by winning Republican women. She couldn't hold them last night when the choice was a former Republican president's son. Today, the governor-elect had a message for Republicans in Washington.
Leave us alone. Let Texas run Texas.
The other Bush running could not unseat the incumbent Democrat in Florida. But a chance meeting today illustrates there is still some civility left in American politics.
I just was driving down US 1 and I saw the crowd and I wanted to come and personally congratulate you.
And in California, Pete Wilson did something that 2 months ago no one could imagine. This Republican won a second term. The Republican tide that had swept the nation swept the Democrat, Kathleen Brown, off the Pacific coast. 2 of the most powerful members of the House, as you probably have heard, were felled in yesterday's Republican romp. Tom Foley, Speaker, and Dan Rostenkowski, one tainted by an indictment on corruption charges, the other apparently tarnished by the position he held. We've 2 reports, beginning with ABC's Ken Kashiwahara.
Even with votes still being counted and the race still close, Tom Foley today congratulated his opponent, thanked his staff, and conceded the outcome.
It appears to me that when all the votes are counted, we may fall a few votes short.
Even last night, Foley seemed to sense he would become a part of history, the first speaker to lose an election in 134 years. He seemed to look to a future Congress without him, with advice for those who would succeed him.
It's important that those people in the Congress, Democrats and Republicans, work together with President Clinton to address the problems of the country.
In the end, George Nethercutt won by doing what Republicans across the country did, linking Foley to an unpopular president and tapping into an electorate angry and frustrated with their government.
It's a voice of the people to change the system that exists in Washington, and that's what we're about.
3 decades ago, a newcomer named Tom Foley defeated a 22-year incumbent by telling voters his opponent had been in office too long. It was an argument that worked then and now. Ken Kashiwahara, ABC News, Spokane.
This is Aaron Hayes in Chicago, where Dan Rostenkowski was philosophical about his stunning tumble from power.
Listen, 36 years is a pretty good run in any man's league.
A run almost no one expected to end. Until last week, Rostenkowski, despite a cloud of indictments hanging over him, was considered by most to be a shoo-in. His opponent, Mike Flanagan, had waged a campaign so low-key and low-budget, he was nearly an unknown. But Flanagan was convinced voters wanted change. The National Republican Party late last week agreed and handed over $50,000 for TV ads. Voters, fed up with the scandal surrounding the incumbent, turned up to turn the congressman out.
I really voted for Flanagan to be totally against Rostenkowski.
They weren't voting so much for Michael Flanagan and what he might stand for in the future. They were really voting for what Rostenkowski had stood for in the past.
It's the measure cutting off most medical and educational benefits to illegal immigrants. Two judges have said not so fast. A federal judge has put any enforcement of the measure on hold, at least until a hearing next week. Earlier, a state judge had blocked enforcement of the provisions requiring public schools to expel illegal immigrants. The battle continues. Here's ABC's Jim Wooten.
The judge's ruling was exactly what these Oakland students had in mind in one of the many anti-187 protests across the state. It also pleased the civil rights lawyers who'd immediately taken the proposition to court this morning, challenging its constitutionality, trying to delay its implementation.
We would have preferred to have prevailed in the court of public opinion. But that not being the case, we will now appeal to the court of law.
Similar suits were also filed by defiant public school officials from the state's largest systems, including Los Angeles. 187 changes nothing, said this board member.
And in terms of education, our children are going to continue to receive those services at our schools, and that they will not be questioned in any way, fashion, or form relative to their immigration status.
Before the judge's ruling, Governor Wilson, who supported 187, said its provisions are now state law and must be treated as such.
The people of California have passed Proposition 187, and now we must enforce it.
But the Supreme Court has already struck down a similar Texas law, so it may be some time before anybody in California, illegal or not, feels any effect from Proposition 187. Peter?
Jim, there was a feeling among some people that Governor Wilson particularly was able to stand on the side of passing this proposition because he knew it would be held up in the courts. Any credibility to that, do you think?
Well, clearly it was a pretty broad and popular political avenue yesterday for a lot of candidates. Whether they, Governor Wilson and others, traveled it cynically, I don't know. But they must have known that given the Texas ruling, that Prop 187 would not have smooth sailing. I think their answer to this question would be that the 5-4 majority, that of the 5 members of that majority that produced the Texas decision, 4 are now gone from the court, and that now, maybe now, their approach might pass constitutional muster.
Okay, Jim Wooten in California, thank you very much. In all, there were 238 propositions on state ballots yesterday, covering everything from crime to false teeth. Georgia now has the toughest sentencing law in the nation. 2 strikes and you're out. Life in prison for a second violent felony. 6 states yesterday approved term limits on Congress. Oregon voters appear to have passed the nation's first right to die law. Terminally ill adults may obtain a prescription for lethal drugs. And gambling casinos were defeated in 4 states. As for the false teeth, it's been a long struggle in Washington state, but finally a victory for denture makers who will
convention. And then Harry Truman pulled off his miracle. But history has a chillier lesson for Bill Clinton. Every Democrat since Roosevelt has faced a serious challenge to renomination. And in the wake of last night's rout, even his allies, like defeated Oklahoma Senate nominee Dave McCurdy, were acknowledging that the president was a heavy political liability. But Bill Clinton is still the president for at least the next 2 years, a job with a fair amount of power even with the Congress in Republican hands. For instance, consider his promise to reinvent government.
There were 11 million.
The president can do a lot of this without the Congress. And simplifying government could remind voters of the new Democrat Clinton they voted for 2 years ago. The president also retains the bully pulpit, the forum from which to speak out on broader themes of right and wrong.
We just got to be honest, children of God.
But the president still faces a chronic problem. Most